Welcome, everyone. I'm Amy Seeley, president of Seeley Test Pros and LEAP, helping students to succeed in all kinds of tests from 8th grade to grad school throughout Ohio.
And I'm Mike Bergen, president of Chariot Learning, helping students with test school and life based out of Rochester, New York.
Between the two of us today, we have over 60 years of experience at the highest levels of the test preparation and supplemental education industries.
We both love to talk and learn about the latest issues in education, testing, and admissions. So let's get down to tests and the rest. The fascinating topic we want to explore today is getting ready for the AP Economics exam. But first, let's meet our special guest, Michael Rodriguez.
Michael Rodriguez is a national champion speaker and debater. He completed his undergraduate degree in economics at Cal State Fullerton in 2012. While in school, he helped perform research on the long-term implications of training students to become financially and economically literate. After college, he worked as an economic consultant to law firms. For the past 10 years, he has worked as a teacher at Modern Brain Academy in Irvine, California, and as a private tutor in AP Economics. When students learn from Coach Michael, they learn how to think like an economist. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Michael, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. We have wanted to learn about the economics exams, both micro and macro, for a long time. Before we dive into those topics, though, we'd love to hear about your history as an educator and what drew you to economics.
So when I graduated high school, went into college, I originally entered to become a mechanical engineer. I was thinking, oh, engineering, that's the future. But I quickly discovered that I actually really disliked the engineering program and was like, okay, I need to figure out something else, but I did want to do something math related.
You wanted something mathematically rigorous and precise, like economics.
Yeah, exactly. Going from a hard science to a soft science. And so, I fell into the field of economics, and I quickly learned that it was kind of exactly what I was looking for. It was a combination of math, but also social science, and a beautiful merging of the two to kind of look at our society through a whole new perspective. So that's what drew me to the economics field.
But you did not become an actual economist.
Not, well, I did for a short period of time.
You did? Okay.
After I graduated, I actually did become a economist for law firms.
Okay.
So a lot of people don't know this, but when you're in a lawsuit and there is some sort of damages, those calculation for the damages needs to come from somewhere. Someone needs to be able to figure out how much money is lost because of what's happened. And that was my job. My job was to sit there and calculate how much damage has actually been incurred because of this. And I was lucky enough to even get to work on the Michael Jackson case.
Wow.
So
I don't think a lot of people would realize that that's how the awards are calculated. I think that most people imagine that they just check people's accounts and they're like, well, how much can they
are they
afford
worth
to pay? Right?
Right.
And that's how much we're going to ask for. We're going to ask for like a dollar more than that.
Yeah, exactly. That's how most people imagine it is. There's like it's just some number you just pull out of thin air. But actually, in a court of law, you need to go in there and in front of a judge explain, Judge, this is how much money needs to be paid over this many years because of this is what it's going to cost to repair what's happened.
So then you left that consulting work, and then how did you end up in terms of teaching economics?
So after I'd done that for a few years, I decided I didn't actually enjoy working with lawyers anymore. So I was looking
Makes
for
sense.
a new opportunity. And my girlfriend at the time told me that, hey, you're really good at explaining things to people. Why don't you go into teaching instead? Because she was working as a substitute teacher. And I said, well, maybe I'll try it out. And I quickly discovered that I was actually quite good at it. And not only that, but that there was a huge need for economics tutoring, especially because most teachers who teach AP economics don't have economics degrees. Most of them are actually history teachers. So economics is not their first field. And so as a result of that, they have a more difficult time explaining the concepts to students, which therefore leads to a huge demand for economics tutoring. And being an economist, I know that if there's a huge demand, then I can fill that supply.
You understood a little bit about the interplay between supply and demand. That's good.
Well, it is funny, though. I remember taking economics in high school and then taking it in college. And college is where I feel like I was really confronted with like those graphs and curves. And, I mean, it can be for students a very academically difficult subject to try to grasp.
It definitely is. The college level is much more rigorous in terms of the math requirements, whereas the high school version, the AP version, is much more like theory and graphing without the mathematical rigor. Now, it is a senior level class, but I often teach it to sophomores and juniors because, as far as the math requirement goes, you only really need to know algebra to be able to complete it. Um, it does help if you've taken calculus because some of the theories which seem more abstract, you can connect it to what you've learned in calculus, but you don't actually need calculus to excel at the class.
So then let's talk a little about exactly what is tested. Obviously, we're talking here about both macroeconomics and microeconomics. Can you give us an idea of like what is tested on each of these two different AP economics exams?
Yes. So with there is some overlap between both of them. So between both the micro and macro, you're going to have basic economic principles such as trade, opportunity cost, as well as supply and demand. And supply and demand is the foundational idea that both of these classes overlap on. From there, you have a divergence. So for the AP micro, you have stuff like consumer choice, which is all about utility maximization. You also have the four market structures: perfect competition, oligopoly, monopoly, monopolistic competition, as well as market failures and government intervention. On the macro side of things, you instead have the economic indicators such as GDP, unemployment, inflation, as well as the business cycle. And then from there, you move into fiscal policy and monetary policy. What's the role of government in terms of the overall health of the larger economy?
Now, generally, is are these courses taught as semester courses, and then if somebody might have a year course in economics for AP?
Yes. So each one is one semester. So you'll see high schools that have both classes, but about half the time you'll see high schools offer a AP government or type class, and then one of these, either AP micro or AP macro.
How does that impact the content on the AP exam itself, or how often it's accepted for credit? If the subject is often taught as a half, is it still considered if a college was going to accept a 4 or a 5 for credit, would they accept full credit for it?
They would, because most colleges do split it into two full classes. So they'll have Econ 101, which is maybe micro, and Econ 102, which is macro. So if you take the AP macro, it will count for one of those classes.
That makes sense.
So how is the test sort of laid out as far as like the scoring system or be able to receive points towards your AP score?
So the test itself has two major sections. It has a 60 question multiple choice and followed by a 3 question free response.
And is that the same
So,
for both, Michael? Like when we're talking about structure, the two exams have the same structure?
yep, both of
Thank you.
them have the exact same structure. And in fact, with the FRQs, the free response questions, both of them have a consistency in terms of the first question. So for AP Micro, the first question is almost always a market structure question. So it could be about a monopoly, it could be about monopolistic competition or perfect competition. On the macro side, the first FRQ question is almost always ADAS, aggregate supply, aggregate demand. So there's a consistency in terms of knowing exactly what the first FRQ question is on both exams.
So, okay, so you were talking about the structure, there's the multiple choice, and so keep going, please.
So the total points you get for the 60 multiple choice questions, it's 1 point each. The FRQs, the 3 FRQs, are 30 points. So altogether, 90 points in total. Now, for the FRQ, to get a little bit into the minutia of it, the actual way they score it is it's not actually 30 points of questions. It might only be 20 points of questions, and they do a multiplier. So each correct answer might be multiplied by 1.5, 1.25. So you're not going to expect to see 30 questions on the FRQ. Each question is just going to be worth a little bit more than a point. And then they'll do that calculation and turn it into 30 points. So perfect score would be 90 points.
What is the typical cutoff for, say, a 4? How many points would you need to earn?
Um, I usually look at it in terms of percentages.
Sure.
So typically when I say to advise my students of like what you're aiming for to get like say a 5, you're looking at somewhere around the 80%-ish
Which is
range.
usually for a lot of the APs, 80% accuracy can be like a
Yeah,
five.
about
Yeah.
to get a 4, you're probably looking around like honestly like a 65% can sometimes get there with a 4. They're pretty forgiving on the macro and micro test.
That's interesting. They're pretty forgiving. So if a student is getting ready for the tests, we'll start with macro and then we'll talk about micro. What are the hot topics? You kind of already alluded to what you might expect in the first essay question or free response question. But what would you tell somebody, you want to be really clear on these topics for microeconomics?
Okay. So fundamental is supply and demand. That is the basis of everything. And with that in mind, graphing. So what I mean by graphing is a lot of students struggle in this class because we're graphing without numbers. It's all abstract graphs. And so what I really recommend to any student entering into the AP Econ class is just going back to the basics and understanding like what a graph means, what it tells you, even if you don't have numbers. Like what is the shape of a graph informing you about? So having that basic understanding and supply and demand, that is the foundation of both classes. Now, diving into the microeconomic side of thing, we then take those supply and demand graphs, apply them to the markets, the business markets. So what does it mean to have a monopoly graph? What does it mean to have a perfect competition graph? What does it mean to have a monopolistic competition graph? So understanding supply and demand is the foundation to then understanding the 4 market graphs, which those 4 markets, including oligopoly, make up around 50% of the test. So you really have to have that.
So when working with students, I'm assuming a lot of them you're really trying to make sure they like master each of the graphs and what those graphs would look like that they can apply potentially to like given like certain economic, sort of criteria in a question. Would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a application test. So what I mean by that is we teach you the concepts. It's not like we teach you the question itself, like they're going to ask you this specific question. They're going to give you a scenario. And what you need to do is take the scenario, interpret it, and then draw the correct graphs to interpret the scenario and then come to a solution from
When
there.
you say draw the correct drafts, you actually have to draw the graph. They don't
On
show
the
you
FRQ,
graphs that you have to choose one. You actually have to
Yes, you have to
sketch it.
draw graphs.
yeah.
Nice.
On the
And
FRQ, it's
and
all
when
yours.
and you have to draw a graph, a numberless graph, meaning this isn't a calculator-based exam or anything like that. You just have to sketch the curve or the trend line.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Now, they did make a change a few years ago to allow basic calculators because before there was no basic calculators allowed during the AP exam. They made that change because some of the questions that are formula-based questions, because they didn't allow calculators before, the numbers always had to be very round, very even for students to solve without using a calculator. They obviously wanted to give themselves some more flexibility in terms of what numbers they're presenting to students. So now they do allow a basic
A
calculator.
basic four-function calculator.
Yeah.
And you just mentioned formulas, which obviously like my as I mentioned earlier, I did do some AP Econ review a few years ago, retaught some econ. As I recall, there are quite a few formulas associated with economics. Do you find that students really do have to make sure they've got those kind of more like rotely memorized going into the test?
Yeah, there are a handful of formulas that do need to be memorized, but the formulas are very simple. We're talking about averages mainly is a lot of the formulas, especially in microeconomics. It's a lot of average calculation. In macroeconomics, you do have a little bit of different types of formulas, such as the spending multiplier, tax multiplier, those types of formulas. But again, they're very simplistic formulas, I would say. It's more so about the logic of the formulas than it is like, do you memorize the formula? It's like, do you memorize what you're supposed to use the formula for, what scenario it's supposed to be used for? And not only that, but how do you derive information from a word problem to then turn that into numbers to then be able to use the formula?
Yeah, so rote memorization is only gets you so far. You really do have to understand sort of the logic behind the formula or its appropriate use in a situation.
Yeah, exactly.
So in terms of students, really focusing, do you find with your students there are certain topics or there's priority topics that you feel like maybe students need to spend more time on reviewing or studying in anticipation of the tests?
Absolutely. Especially, we talked about in terms of micro, the four markets. In terms of looking to the macro side of things, we have to think about fiscal policy and monetary policy really being the big two. So those two kind of make up 50% of roughly the macro test. So in those terms, what we're looking at is we're looking at the aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph, which is kind of a big supply and demand graph for the entire economy, and then being able to appropriately connect that to other graphs, such as the Phillips curve, which is all about inflation and unemployment, or the money market, which is about the Federal Reserve and setting the money supply, or about the loanable funds market, the government borrowing money and how that affects interest rates. You have to be able to understand the interconnection between all of these different graphs and how by affecting one graph, it's going to then lead to a chain reaction on these other graphs. So macro is all about, can you connect this bigger system together and know these four graphs and how these four graphs are going to interact with each other? Because if you can kind of show that, it's going to make it a lot easier in terms of comprehending the questions that they're going to be asking you.
So you've identified a lot of skills that students need to master going into the test. How do you recommend they do so? If they're not fully capable of doing everything you just described at a high level, what's the next step?
So one of the things I really recommend for students is actually taking a note card approach. And what I mean by that in terms of taking a note card approach, I think a lot of students, when they think of note cards, they think I write down some term and then maybe on the other side write down the definition of the term, and that's how I memorize these terms. Economics, like there are some terms you need to know, but it's not a terms test. It is an application test. Rather, what I recommend students do is they write down a type of question. So, for example, maybe the question has to do with the Federal Reserve changing the money supply. They're increasing the money supply or they're decreasing the money supply. And what I instead, on the other side, you should write down what is the chain reaction of that process. So it's like, if they do this, it leads to this, and then this, and then this. And I can draw and explain why each step happens. That's kind of the way I tell students to approach it is if you can explain the step-by-step process of how to solve the problems, that is way more valuable because that's what you have to ultimately just demonstrate on the exam.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, where do students find the core questions, right? Instead of just thumbing through their textbook and pulling out random concepts, how do they know specifically what questions they should be prepared to work that flow chart for?
So, one of the great things is that the AP themselves post all of their FRQs. So they have all of their FRQs posted on their website from 2012 all the way up to 2024.
This is on the College Board site for each individual advanced
AP
placement
is AP
exam.
Central or
Yes, on the College Board
Perfect.
website. So they have all their FRQs there. What I've done for my students is I basically put together a spreadsheet where I said, each year there's 3 FRQ questions. What are those FRQ questions on? Okay, question number 1, aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Question number 2, unemployment. Question number 3, government intervention, something like that. So I categorized all of the FRQ questions, and then you can just kind of tally to see how often they ask each of these questions. So you can kind of get a sense of what percentages the AP likes to play with in terms of which questions they like to ask more frequently. Ultimately, there's like roughly, I would say about 10 different types of FRQ questions. Those 10 FRQ questions cover almost all the material in the exam. So if you can explain the step-by-step process of answering all 10 different types of FRQ questions, you're going to be able to handle the multiple choice question section as well. In addition to that, I do recommend a book, The 5 Steps to a 5. I What I recommend from them
Five
is
steps to a
their
five. We've heard of that one before.
Yes.
I recommend their 500 multiple choice question book, not necessarily their actual AP book, but the multiple choice question book. And the reason I recommend it is because, like I said, this is an application type test. So what students really need to get into the mode of is reading the questions and reading the questions carefully. That is the biggest pitfall see students fall into is they read a question, they go, "Oh, I know exactly what this is about,"
And
and
yeah.
they just skim through to the end, and they skip an important word, which completely flips or changes the way you're supposed to apply the concept.
Well, that is the challenge of test prep, even in general, right? Sometimes our students can be so prepared that they actually kind of read over read past the question, and like you said, they miss some critical difference in this question from maybe something that they have been exposed to before, which is a very common error, I think, in preparing for tests. As far as, so you've mentioned some resources. Are there any other resources for preparation that you find are really useful or helpful for your students?
Absolutely. So a lot of students these days, they're not into reading giant books. They want something that they can
You
watch and
think?
listen to and follow along. And there is a great resource on YouTube. Teacher, AP Econ teacher, very famous AP Econ teacher, Jacob Clifford. And he has a fabulous YouTube channel, which he constantly updates with great summaries and explanation, as well as does a good job of incorporating real world examples into his explanation of things for students. And he's become so successful that you'll find that a lot of AP teachers out
No,
there.
I remember that when we did some AP Econ work, yeah, his stuff was all over the place, like helping teachers, right? And teachers learning some of the Facebook groups for AP Econ teachers. They're promoting his material because it's really good. It's really good for students.
Oh yeah, if you're a student in an AP class, don't be surprised if the worksheets you have are written by actually Jacob Clifford
He's
instead.
like he's the AP Econ celebrity, right?
Absolutely.
In this small part of the AP world universe, right? He's doing a lot over there for students for sure.
Yes.
Are there any other things you can think of or mention that you think would be useful or helpful for students to know in preparing, to do well on the AP economics exams?
Um, the last thing I'd really want to emphasize with students in terms of for this exam is don't be afraid to draw the graphs. When you're doing the multiple choice section, a lot of students are worried about time. It's 60 questions with 70 minutes. Okay, so you're roughly a little over a minute per question. And so a lot of students think because of that time crunch, they don't have time to draw the graphs. They don't have time to draw the supply and demand. They're like, we just got to get through it as fast as possible. Okay. And if you look at the actual AP results, it's not uncommon for the very last question to only have a 5% accuracy because most students never even get to the last question. But that's okay. It's okay to not get to the last two or three questions if you get all the questions before correct because you took the time to draw the graph. Don't rush it. Don't think I can just do it in my head and therefore I'm going to get the right answer. Because when you draw the graph, it's going to show you what the right answer is, and
Do
therefore you don't make the mistake.
do they give partial credit for do they give partial credit for any of that within those graphing questions?
For on the FRQ, you can get partial credit. And in relation to that, not taking shortcuts, label your graphs. There are too many
Yeah,
students
right.
who draw their graphs and then don't label what the lines are, don't label what the axis is. The AP testing very explicitly says you lose half your credit if you don't label your points. So um, so you will get on the FRQ part, you will get partial credit for the graph, even if it's inaccurate. At least if you labeled things and showed the graph, you will still get some points.
So that's an
Uh,
easy step for students to take to make sure they lock in at least partial credit.
yeah, absolutely. Show your work. Even on calculation questions on the FRQ, if you showed the formula, you can still get something out of it.
That's fantastic, Michael. We could obviously speak with you all day about the AP economics exams. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. This has been a real fun event.
If listeners would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, if you're interested in reaching out to me, you can reach me at michael@modernbrain.com. That's my email address at my school. I'm happy to answer questions, and I do work as a tutor as well.
Awesome. We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Be sure to join us for another fascinating topic and guest on the next Tests and the Rest.
Did you enjoy this episode as much as we did? Find expanded links and more for this and all of our episodes at our show page at testsandtherest.com. While you're there, be sure to explore everything the larger TestBright site has to offer, including real, expert, unbiased answers to the toughest admissions testing questions. Of course, we'd love for you to rate, review, and subscribe to Tests and the Rest on your favorite podcast platform. If there's a topic or guest you'd like us to feature, just let us know and spread the word.